Disciplined people don't disappear because they lose control. They disappear precisely when they believe they have too much control. This is the paradox almost no one notices. The image we have of a disciplined person is someone consistent, reliable, organized, resilient. And many times that's true. But there's a specific point where this same discipline becomes the reason for a silent disappearance. Not a dramatic abandonment, not a visible collapse, but a discreet, almost elegant fading away that happens without noise and without a conscious decision. You may have lived this yourself. You were doing well, following the plan, keeping the rhythm, doing what needed to be done. You saw yourself as someone responsible, someone who doesn't rely on motivation, someone who shows up even when it's not easy. And then, at some point, life shifts a little. Not everything, just a little. A routine adjustment, accumulated fatigue, a temporary priority. Nothing that seems serious. And precisely because of that, you don't go into alert mode. You think everything is under control, that you'll adjust later, that you know how to come back. The problem is that disciplined people trust this ability to come back too much. They believe consistency is something that can be paused and resumed intact, like a switch. On, off, on again. But the brain doesn't work that way. The brain works through continuity, through presence, through connection. And every time you step away completely, even thinking it's just for a while, something changes in that connection. Not in a visible way, but in a deep one. Most people think those who disappear are the ones who lose motivation. But disciplined people don't disappear when they're unmotivated. They disappear when they're tired but rational, when they decide that right now it's not worth doing things the right way. And because they don't like doing anything halfway, they choose to do nothing. What seems coherent with their own standard becomes the beginning of distance. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much about the ideal way of doing things. There's a very specific moment when this happens. It's the day you realize you won't perform the way you'd like, that you won't be able to maintain the level you consider acceptable, that it's going to be an okay day. Less demanding people do less. Disciplined people tend to do nothing. And it's in that nothing that the disappearance begins. Not because one day without action destroys everything, but because it introduces a dangerous pattern. Action only happens when your ideal version is available. The brain learns fast. It doesn't learn from internal speeches. It learns from repeated behavior. If you only show up when you're at your best, it records that this isn't part of who you are under normal conditions. It's only part of who you are under perfect conditions. And since perfect conditions are rare, presence also becomes rare. Little by little, something that was once part of your identity turns into something you do when you can. And everything that falls into that category begins to disappear from real life. The climax of this process isn't the moment you stop. It's the moment you try to return. After a few days, weeks, or months, the idea of resuming comes loaded with weight. It's not desire, it's pressure. The feeling that now it would have to be better than before, more organized, more consistent, because you know how to do it. Right. That weight doesn't come from the action itself. It comes from the identity you've built, from internal expectations. And the higher the standard, the heavier it feels to come back after a break. That's why so many disciplined people live in strange cycles. They start strong, disappear without realizing it, and then need a huge emotional effort to come back. Every return requires internal negotiation, rebuilding identity, and a promise to do better next time. And that's exhausting. Not the habit itself, but the constant need to restart. Over time, the brain begins to associate that habit not with progress, but with weight, and then the disappearing becomes even more frequent. The problem isn't discipline. It's rigidity, the idea that there is only one valid way to continue, one complete, intense, organized way. When that way isn't possible, nothing is possible. And this all-or-nothing mindset is what makes disciplined. People disappear without noticing, because they don't call it quitting. They call it a strategic pause, respecting their limits, maturity. But the brain doesn't interpret it that way. It interprets absence. The shift happens when you understand that real discipline isn't about maintaining a high level all the time. It's about maintaining the connection, even when the level drops. It's about continuing to show up in different versions of yourself. A strong version for good days, and a minimal version for bad days. Disciplined people usually build only the first one. And when it fails, there's nothing left. Those who stop disappearing build both. And that changes everything. From that moment on, bad days stop being days of shutdown. They become days of maintenance. The goal isn't performance. It's not disappearing, not breaking the thread, not letting things drop to zero. This doesn't require extreme willpower. It requires redefining what counts as a win. Reading one page instead of studying for an hour. Opening the file instead of producing something brilliant. thinking for 2 minutes instead of solving everything. These gestures seem too small for someone demanding, but they are exactly what keep identity alive. When you do this, something deep changes. You stop being someone who does it when they can and become someone who always shows up, even a little. The brain registers this quiet consistency, and over time, doing more stops feeling heavy because you never fully left. You don't need to convince yourself. You just continue. Few people talk about this because the discipline narrative usually glorifies intensity, sacrifice, and maximum effort. But what sustains any practice in the long run is the ability not to disappear when circumstances aren't ideal. Disciplined people disappear without noticing because they confuse high standards with consistency. And consistency isn't that. Consistency is continuous, adaptable, imperfect presence. If you look at your life right now, there's probably something you used to do well, with discipline, that is now in the background. Not because you quit, but because you kept waiting for the right moment to come back. That's the sign, not of failure, but of rigidity. The good news is that this can be corrected today with a minimal gesture, something small enough not to create resistance, but big enough to maintain the connection. Now I want to hear from you. In which area of your life do you notice that you disappear when you can't maintain the ideal standard? Fitness, studying, work, self-care, personal projects? Write it in the comments. Making it conscious is the first step to stopping the disappearance. If this video resonated with you, leave a like. It helps this content reach other disciplined people who are blaming themselves without understanding what's really happening. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. Not as a grand promise, but as a small gesture of continuity. Because in the end, discipline isn't about never failing. It's about never disappearing.